Robert Downey Jr. was the coolest of the Brat Pack. Let's just say that.
Robert Downey Jr.'s reputation has developed in a fantastically strange fashion. I mean, he was the first SNL cast member to be nominated for a lead actor Oscar.
Who's Robert Downey Jr.? I mean, he made a couple of films. This guy's going to star as Charlie Chaplin.
And this is actually a message to every director who will ever direct him. Shut up, back off, and enjoy what he gives you.
His drug problems were such that for a couple of years, we saw more pictures of him at the Malibu port talking to judges than we did any movies at the multiplex.
You understand all of the consequences of your play?
Yes, I do.
Whenever you start using heroin, period, but when you're using heroin when you're working, I think you're not going to go to a good place. I mean, that's the beginning of the end.
I just didn't think it was the end of Robert Downey Jr. career-wise. I thought Robert Downey Jr. would wind up being dead somewhere.
Everyone roots for him, and everyone wants him to succeed.
You know, I hate to throw that word genius around. It's almost like a joke. Everyone in Hollywood's a genius. This guy, on the other hand, is awfully creative. He's a real force.
Robert Downey Jr. is associated with both the highest Hollywood honors
This certainly means a lot to me.
and the lowest of celebrity pitfalls.
I think the average person in the street, if you say Robert Downey Jr. to them, they're going to think very talented actor who had drug problems and spent a lot of time in jail and was a troubled guy.
I would say amazing actor comes before troubled drug addict, because when you're talking about Hollywood, everybody's got problems of one sort or another.
One thing that everyone can agree on is that Robert Downey Jr. is never boring, on screen or off.
Robert Downey Jr. is somebody who's thought of as a really groundbreaking actor, a guy who takes risks, somebody who has really lived on the edge his whole time in Hollywood. This is a guy who's never held back.
Robert Downey Jr.'s reputation has developed in a fantastically strange fashion. I mean, it can really be summed up by saying that he was the first SNL cast member to be nominated for a lead actor Oscar, which is really strange if you think about it.
And I think that Robert Downey Jr. is one of those talents who is so committed to performance, so committed to character, that he'll just roll with it. He'll go wherever the character needs to go, and I think it's taken him to dangerous places.
For a decade, Robert became one of the world's most famous drug casualties. His countless run-ins with the law came to a head in November of 2000. He was working on the hit show Ally McBeal. When the show broke for the Thanksgiving holiday, Downey checked into a hotel in Palm Springs for 4 days of debauchery.
He went on a weekend bender, and this included all-nighters, strippers, drugs. It was as crazy as you could get. His weekend ended on a very bad note. Cops ended up coming to his hotel room, and they found 4 ounces of cocaine and a Wonder Woman costume from some woman who had skipped out just before they got there.
Robert Downey Jr. has said that this period was his rock bottom.
I just didn't think it was the end of Robert Downey Jr. career-wise. I thought Robert Downey Jr. would wind up being dead somewhere.
Robert not only lived, he rose from the ashes to pull off one of the most unlikely comebacks in Hollywood history. Thanks in no small part to a group of supporters who were always willing to give him another chance.
So I'll do a line, you do a line. And I don't mean cocaine, okay?
He's very well liked. For all his problems, for all his difficulties, he's very well liked.
Robert Downey Jr. is the kind of guy that you want to hang out with. He plays the piano, he's funny. When you see him in interviews, he's always engaging and entertaining.
When they put on my head, I get a little Nicholsonian in myself.
And it's almost like everyone roots for him and everyone wants him to succeed.
Well, it's a testament to how talented Robert Downey Jr. is, that in a town where often you don't get a first chance and rarely get a second chance, this guy's had many chances.
Downey was finally able to get clean in 2005. With a little help from his friends, he made 10 films in the next 2 years. It was a staggering number for any actor, much less one who many thought would never work again.
I think for a couple of years there, he became a sort of punchline for jokes about drug addicts. And I think in the last couple of years, that's faded away, because that ultimately was a lot of personal crap that he and the people around him had to pay a price for.
I would say that Robert Downey Jr. is back. I mean, I think he's taken small roles in numerous films that display his acting ability, and some of them are really quality films, like Zodiac or like Good Night, Good Luck.
I think there was a sense that because he went to hell in a handbasket in full view of the public and lived to talk about it, that he deserves a break.
Robert's career recovery has led to his biggest break yet. In 2008, he will star in his first genuine Hollywood blockbuster, Iron Man.
Iron Man is a real test for Robert Downey Jr. because it is a major film, a superhero movie. This is a franchise, potentially, and I think it's going to signal a whole new chapter for him as an actor and as a person who can really carry a big movie, who can be a leading man.
Iron Man has an extremely troubled past. I mean, the character is a weaponeer and an arms dealer who's very conflicted about his work and an alcoholic. So again, the idea of Robert Downey Jr. playing a flawed superhero makes perfect sense to me.
He pointed out he's never really starred in a $100 million picture. It's not only an opportunity to try something new and to make his mark in what he hopes will be a box office smash, but to kind of take on an iconic role and make it his own.
In his 40s, Robert's career and personal life were better than ever. He still had a compulsive personality, but he focused it on work, kung fu workouts, and his family.
Robert had a bit of a rebirth, almost. He met this woman, Susan Levin, who's a producer. They ended up getting married. They really have this solid relationship, and he's a changed man.
Once a definitive decision is made, and I know that there's all the stuff about it's a disease, it's a moral dilemma, it's this, it's all this other stuff, but I think at the end of the day, it's the lack of making a solid personal decision. And sometimes the stakes have to be so high that it's clear.
Robert has become committed, and that's all that's happened, is he's now committed to a drug-free lifestyle.
He's dedicated to his sobriety. He calls himself a soccer dad. He's really interested in raising his son and being a good role model and being a good husband and just kind of going through life and not falling back into his old habits.
Well, they'll find I'm not under the influence because that's no longer an option. It's just too much fun doing stuff like this.
Though he became clean and sober, Robert still bears some scars, but most feel he wears them well.
You really see in his face and in his performances the entire arc of his life. He's bringing a complexity and a real pathos to his roles that I think comes through, that the pain that he's felt in his life, the reversals that he's felt are there, and I think that they've made him a better actor.
When you talk about his comeback nowadays, it's almost passé. I mean, he's back. He's come back.
Right now, I'm just enjoying the way things are going. And I certainly wouldn't want to imagine that I've arrived anywhere, but I'm certain, I'm moving, and that feels good.